we are talking Yakuza Princess. This one is directed by Vincent Amorim and stars Masumi, who is apparently a singer, and Jonathan Rhys Meyers. Now this is obviously a Yakuza story with kind of a Western production feel to it. One of my favourite films of yesteryear is actually the early Viggo Mortensen movie American Yakuza, and by that title it sounds like it's going to be a trashy movie, but I really liked it. So I was actually quite keen to watch this movie, which kind of, at least on the trailer, gave me kind of similar vibes. Anyway, what is the story? So it focuses on this young girl who is the only survivor at a kind of a massacre at her family. And it turns out that family is actually a Yakuza kind of clan. And it cuts to kind of 20 years later, and it actually takes place in Brazil, which apparently has the largest population of Japanese people outside of Japan. And now, as a kind of a young adult, she's kind of pretty much on her own, kind of just works in a shop, things like this. But she's kind of like still remembers, that she was kind of somewhat displaced, shall we say. Anyway, and as it turns out, she is essentially the kind of the legacy of this this particular kind of Yakuza clan, and the past comes back to her when she meets a variety of people, including a amnesiac guy played by Jonathan Rhys Meyers, who has got this kind of like sword, which is just ultimately the kind of like the central piece of this movie, almost the MacGuffin, if you will, which everyone kind of like claims is like an ancient sword that can trap the souls of its victims and all that kind of stuff, along with kind of various people from her past, from the Yakuza coming back. And what will happen? Well, you're going to have to watch the movie to find out. Does that plot sound a little bit kind of convoluted to you? There's a reason for that. Anyway, but let's talk about what works, first of all, I think, in this movie. I have to say this movie has a certain directorial flourish in the way that it's kind of filmed. I think, having watched as many films as I do, a lot of the time the direction's kind of, its surfaces are all but flat, not particularly kind of artistic. This one, I would say, there's definitely some kind of flourishes in the kind of the directorial style, kind of like some of the kind of the transitions, the camera placement, that kind of thing. And it does give it a somewhat very mild art house feel to it to a certain degree, but not into the point where I would call it an arty film. But it certainly has some artistic value in its kind of direction here. I also have to say the combat scenes, the kind of the fight scenes here are very brutal and seem particularly kind of like I don't know, just kind of like there's a finality to it, I guess. When someone goes down with a sword, they get down hard. Admittedly, there's a little bit of kind of like CGI blood here and there, which I didn't think was necessary, to be honest. But nonetheless, when we see kind of someone get hit by a sword or a punch, there's a real kind of feel of impact and kind of like wherever it's hitting someone is doing some genuine kind of damage. And, it gives a level of brutality that I think maybe is missing from a lot of kind of like modern films here and there. I do think the cinematography is fantastic. There are some really kind of like moody and atmospheric sequences. There's a great sequence that takes place in kind of a graveyard, and a real good use of kind of like light and kind of like to people's kind of like torches or flashlights if you're in the States and things like this, to give it a really almost that particular sequence, especially like a horror movie kind of feel to it, which I thought was quite good. And the movie just has a kind of a stylish kind of quality to it, which I found was kind of quite endearing. And I'm actually quite a big fan of this kind of like subgenre, as I say. Criminal kind of gangs and stuff are always pretty interesting. I always thought that the Yakuza, with their more strict kind of rules and kind of honour-bound system is somewhat interesting and a little different from the kind of the normal kind of like Mafia films maybe than you'll kind of watch. What doesn't work for me, I have to say that there's a couple of problems. There's three big problems with this movie. The first one, and I think the most important here, is the narrative is very convoluted and quite confused at times as well. just the way this movie is told, and it's not a particularly kind of complex plot exactly, but the way it's told with people kind of being introduced, cuts at certain times, you know, it makes the movie seem particularly kind of confused, and especially the kind of like the story kind of have leading up to this point. It just doesn't seem like it's told in a particularly cohesive way. So the narrative flow of this movie seems kind of extremely choppy. So you're not really sure, for example, people's kind of motivations, why they are there, things like this. It's just the narrative kind of path of this movie, unfortunately, is definitely one of the kind of the weaker elements to this film. Masumi, who is our kind of our female lead, and as I say, she by trade is a singer. I'm someone who I'm not familiar with, to be honest with you. I have to say is rather flat on the old acting department. I think especially when there's dialogue scenes, I think her kind of physical acting isn't necessarily too bad here. But when she's asked to do kind of like dialogue scenes, I think she's really kind of struggling here to give a kind of a believable performance, because it just doesn't seem like she's given much direction really, or she's kind of really kind of grasping any type of emotional weight to kind of her dialogue scenes, which do seem quite flat, as I say. There are, and the other thing is as well, Jonathan Rhys Meyers' character, who is the kind of like the Caucasian character of this movie, to kind of, I guess, to appeal to Western audiences more, seems somewhat superfluous to the plot. The whole kind of like reason he's there is revealed, but it's kind of because he's like has amnesia. But well, a couple of things with him. So his whole being there actually seems somewhat kind of unnecessary. Do you know what I mean? It's like the whole reason why he's you know, in the plot, when you do find out, I think that could have been handled better. He just seems very much like a spare part in the movie. And I have to say as well, the kind of amnesia, I'm not quite sure if I was buying all of that, to be honest with you. It just seemed like the amnesia was somewhat specific in things he couldn't remember, like that suits the plot. But things like his combat training and stuff, no worries, you know, that's all remembered. And he seems to be quite, you know, capable of being somewhat of a detective and finding out where certain things are. Not confused. It just seems like a very kind of ropey depiction of amnesia to me. Just kind of like conveniently kind of forgetting, you know, aspects of who he is, but not forgetting any type of skills or moxie that he might have, and things like this, not being kind of at all confused and totally driven. It didn't really kind of ring true to me. So, and to be honest with you, they're quite significant problems. So, I think this movie ultimately is bogged down by quite poor storytelling, some kind of ropey acting, and some quite poor characterization, which are all quite major issues here. Stylistically, visually, it's a good movie in regards to those areas specifically. And, you know, there are some exciting action set pieces here that are well filmed. It's just the story around it and some of the characters within it are weak. So I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 10. I was going to say a 4, I'll be honest. But just because of the kind of the filmmaking style on a technical level here, I will say a 5, because I do think it does elevate it to some degree. It still makes it an interesting watch, even though I think the story is somewhat bunkum. So it's a 5 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.